So the title I was given was Gulf Coast Water Quality Issues. And that's a really good title because one of my mentors is a man named Bill Hammond who's done environmental education since the 60s here in South Florida. I see some of you nodding. So Bill taught me that problems are fact-based and issues are value-based. So we have an opportunity to talk about the problems and find out what the facts are. But the solutions are value-based, right? And so somehow, if we want to work on the solutions, we have to find enough shared values that we can triangulate our acts and our information and our behaviors to those solutions. So science is really great as a way of knowing. It teaches you things, right? You learn things. But science doesn't do anything. You know, it's responsible of us to do things. And it is Martin Luther King Day. So I think there's a lot of environmental justice and equity, those sorts of things that are embedded in water quality issues, nationwide, worldwide. All right, so I want to tell you a little bit about my background. I am originally from Missouri. It's the show me state. So I tell lots of my students, you have to show me, right? I went back to college when I was about 26 years old after I had run a Winchell's Donut shop that was open for 24 hours. And I ended up getting my bachelor's degree at the University of Missouri-Rolla, which was a well-known engineering school. And then I went to Oregon State University. And yeah, you know Oregon State? Yeah. So I went to Oregon State University for my master's and then my PhD. And I spent a good bit of that time at the Hatfield Marine Science Center. And my master's and PhD were about the effects of stress on our immune response, and primarily the fight or flight response. And since, you know, there's this controversy, is stress good for you, is stress bad for you, right? And so the fight or flight response, obviously we wouldn't still have if there wasn't good benefit for it. So that's my background as a comparative immunologist. I came to Florida Gulf Coast University right after I finished my PhD. I had 1 year at the Evergreen State College, and then I came to FGCU the year it opened, which was 1997. And when I got here, I found out that there had been a lawsuit against the state of Florida for the siting of the university in panther habitat. And I came to FGCU because of their mission statement, because of the focus on sustainability, environmental education, civic engagement, service learning. And when I got here and found out that I had joined an institution that was in some ways contrary to my philosophy and, you know, the reason I came, it was like, oh my goodness, what am I going to do? And it turns out that there was, as a result of the lawsuit, there was a settlement agreement that called for the establishment of the Estero Bay Agency on Bay Management. And that was kind of modeled after the Tampa Bay Agency on Bay Management. And as a member of that organization, I actually represented the Responsible Growth Management Coalition, which is the group that sued the state of Florida for citing the university where it is. So I was raised Catholic, so it's kind of been my penance for a good number of years now. And so I got told that I'm bad. You know, I'm bad for water quality. I'm bad because I use a septic tank. And I'm bad because I use pesticides and fertilizers in my yard. So my husband really liked that beautiful green turf that, you know, goes forever. And so I said, okay, so how bad am I? And which of those things is worse? And what can I do about it? That isn't going to cost a whole lot of money. Because I live in a community that was built in the 60s and 70s. It's primarily working class people. And we didn't have a lot of money we still don't have a lot of money to fix these problems. Okay? And so I started doing research to find out, okay, well, how much of the pollutants that are going into the water are because of my septic tank? And how much of it is because of the pesticides and the fertilizers, right? And so it goes. So there's agriculture, right, that's putting pollutants into our water, nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus that we all know are responsible for the red tides and the blue-green algae blooms. But we also use toilets and wastewater treatment facilities, especially now that they're getting very, very old and the infrastructure is not staying up to it. We use septic, like I do in my community, and we use an awful lot of reuse water. Do you know what reuse water is? Yeah, so it's all the pink pipes. And I didn't really know about that when I started this. I thought it was like, okay, fertilizer, septic tanks. So I started this out with a stable nitrogen isotope research. And so it turns out that, just nitrogen, there's a heavy and light version of it. And humans, and then they look at the ratio of N14 to N15, and it turns out that humans and organisms that eat other organisms have a higher stable nitrogen isotope ratio than lightning, right, that's putting nitrogen into the atmosphere and into the soils and stuff, or vegetarians and that sort of thing. And so I started with that, and I found, of course, in my community of San Carlos Park, that we had stable nitrogen isotopes ratios that were higher than background. The background, I think, is about 1.0. And then I found out about reuse water, and all the golf courses that get the effluent from the wastewater treatment facilities and then use that water to irrigate the golf courses. And we're now using that water in many, many communities, in all the verges along all our roadsides, just all over the place. And so I ended up also sampling at some of the lakes, the lake from the golf course that got the reuse water, as well as other lakes from the golf courses that didn't get the reuse water, but obviously were stormwater ponds that were getting that drainage. So let's see. That's not the right page. So then there's something much more insidious in the water than just nitrogen and phosphorus. And they're called environmental endocrine disruptors. And these are primarily products, consumer products that we use. It's easy to remember them as the 4 Ps. So pharmaceuticals, all of the medications that we take, atenolol, metformin, antidepressants, mood stabilizers, all of these that we use, we don't metabolize them fully. And we're excreting them into the water and as urine, but also in our feces. And so those 4 sources, you've got pharmaceuticals, and then you've got personal care products. So shampoos, conditioners, lotions, all of these things, especially quite often now they're seeing close connections between liver cancer and women that are using ethnic hair care products. So many of the products that we use have these endocrine disrupting compounds in them as the personal care products. Many fragrances, almost anything that's a synthesized fragrance has endocrine disrupting components. I'll tell you a little more about that in a sec. So we did pharmaceuticals, we did personal care products, of course pesticides and herbicides are endocrine disruptors, and the last one is plasticizers. And so, if we go back to when I was a kid, or maybe even, you guys, we didn't have a world full of plastic like we do now. It just wasn't there. And so the effects on humans of these endocrine disruptors is frightening. So the increase in incidences that we see of ADD, ADHD, autism, the autism spectrum, obesity, all the different neurodivergences are all linked to exposure to endocrine disruptors. It's not the only cause, but it is highly implicated in all of these conditions. And the reason I say it's insidious is because they work at very, very low concentrations. So a typical toxicology, you have a linear dose-response curve. The dose makes the poison, right? But these endocrine disruptors, there's two major differences. One is that the response is a U-shaped curve. So very, very low concentrations are very, very problematic. Parts per trillion. A drop in an Olympic swimming pool is very problematic. The middle doses aren't as problematic, and then when you get to the higher concentrations, they act much more like a typical toxin. Probably a lot of the cancer relationships are because of those potentially super high doses. But the other thing is that they affect future generations. Okay? So these were first discovered or recognized in the 1950s when women were taking diethylstarobin, DES, for pregnancy, reducing nausea and potentially holding pregnancies instead of a miscarriage. And it turned out that those women that had daughters, their daughters were okay, but their granddaughters had a problem. And it was like, what the heck is going on here? And women, girls, are born with all of the eggs they'll ever have in their lifetime. And so it turns out that if I am a mother-to-be and I have the womb of a daughter, if in my womb is a daughter, that daughter has all of the eggs that she will be as an adult. And so that's that's why I say it's so insidious, because it goes through generations. And the other thing is, we usually think about evolution, and the other question is, how did we get such an increase in all of these incidences so quickly? Because after World War II, during World War II, just this explosion of chemistry, right? All of these, up to 80,000 chemicals now that we're using in our environment, primarily almost all of them without any regulation in this country. And so instead of evolution where you're changing the genes, it's called epigenetics, where you're making modifications to the entire DNA structure. But we don't have to go there either. I just wanted to mention some of that background of it. So how do I find out what's going on, that sort of stuff? So a really neat thing is that there's this little fish called gambusia, and it's known as a mosquito fish. And you guys know about mosquito fish, gambusia? So it's I think that slide in the corner has it. So it turns out that the female gambusia give live birth, okay? And so the male have an anal fin that is specialized to deliver sperm to the female. And then the female gives live birth. So it turns out that about 1980s, there was some research done in northern Florida downstream from the paper mills, the GP paper mills, that found that the female mosquito fish were masculinized. And they saw this by a very simple morphological change to the anal fin, where the first couple anal fin rays were elongated. Okay? And so since then, that research has been done around the world, Australia, China, anywhere where you find mosquito fish. And mosquito fish are everywhere now, it seems. We had, they're native to here, but they've been imported and they're an invasive species in many parts of the world because people brought them in to eat the mosquitoes, right? And so they're a really great model organism for us. And then we're also working on detecting the actual chemicals in the water. And that's very, very expensive. So let me see what notes I left behind here. Okay, so I learned about endocrine disrupting chemicals when I came to the Hatfield Marine Science Center in about 1994. They premiered a movie put out by the BBC called Assault on the Male. I see a few of you nodding. Did you guys see it? Or yeah. And so that was like, oh my goodness, this is a problem, and this is a problem for young people. And this is a problem that people that are going to be parents should know about. And so I've been teaching a course on endocrine disruptors since I came to the university in '97 and started this research probably in about 2018 or 2019. So we started sampling just in my community of San Carlos Park. So it's about 5 square miles. It's the ditch and drain mentality. So the older communities that we were just draining lots and lots of canals to get the water off the landscape as quick as we could. And 80% of the homes use septic tanks. And one of the environmental justice is that probably about 50 of those homes are using drinking water wells. And those drinking water wells are not like I'm used to in Missouri, where the well's a couple hundred feet deep and the water is just cold and delicious. You know, these are groundwater wells. And so opportunity for lots of these chemicals to make their way into their wells, and they have. So I started with the nutrients, and that graph over there, that poster that's sitting on the ground, you can see very clear signatures of the nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus, that really got elevated after Hurricane Irma. And so we know that these big storm events are stirring up those sediments, and in those sediments were lots and lots of nutrients that then get put in the water column and are responsible for the lengthy expansion of these harmful algal blooms. And so I thought it was expensive at the things that I could use to determine if there was human impact to the water is sucralose, also known as Splenda. So it turns out that Splenda, sucralose, is sweet, but you don't digest it, right? And so it passes through out our urine, essentially exactly how it went in. And samples cost about $50 in each to determine how much sucralose is in them. And so that's spendy for me and my undergraduate students, and that's what we used for a good long time. And then there were other papers that came out, and it was like, well, sucralose is so recalcitrant, it never degrades, that you can find sucralose in water that's just been years and years potentially since there was a human impact, and there's still a relationship between the concentration of sucralose and the impact, the amount of impact of humans. But I needed to know more about it. And so in the past few years, colleagues in the Department of Chemistry, we started looking for other ways to detect more of these compounds. And so some of these posters that you're going to see, we finally got the methods underway. Two of the things that we're finding most often in these waters is DEET. It was like, where's all this DEET coming from? Well, it's our shower, right? I mean, we are forever, I'm not, but a lot of people are forever spraying themselves with DEET, and that's coming out in the waters. And the other one is ethylparaben, which is a plasticizer and in personal care products. And so those are the two that we've found most often, but I'm just getting those methods underway. Atrazine, which is a pesticide, and other chemicals, antibiotics, all of these we now know are endocrine disruptors. And the really interesting thing that we've discovered in the past decade or so is many of them work by affecting our microbiota. So we used to think that we were just humans, right? And now we know that there are more cells in and on our body from bacteria and viruses than there are human cells. And as we ingest things and put them on our skin, we are messing with that. I mean, so most of you probably have heard about after you do a course of antibiotics, you might end up taking some yogurt or something to try to reconstitute the normal microbiota that was there. So it turns out that we're finally starting to understand that one of the mechanisms is the way that these microbiota are talking to our body and telling our body what it needs to do. And so they're called endocrine disruptors. Endocrines are hormones that are released into our bloodstream, and they affect the thymus, they affect our adrenal glands, and the problems that I talked about in humans are primarily problematic to developing fetuses and youngsters. So behavior problems, IQ, all sorts of problems. Let me see what else I got. Hold on. How am I doing for time? 10 more minutes. All right, so I guess I can wrap it up because I really want to hear from you guys and talk to you about it. We found increases in, so what we're doing for the females is just the ratio. It's really nice because it's so easy, between the 4th and the 6th anal fin ray. So a normal female mosquito fish, her anal fin is this beautiful fan shape, okay? And then as it's masculinized, the first couple of anal fins get extended. And so my assumption was that when I collected mosquito fish from my community of San Carlos Park, where we use septic tanks, my assumption was that there would be more and more masculinized females there than in other communities, right? Because septic systems are bad. That's the message, right? Septic systems are bad. So it turns out that I was also sampling in a community in Cape Coral, and on 4 different golf courses, and every place that I sample, I have permission to sample with the caveat that I do not identify the place. You know, so to be able to sample on 4 different golf courses is big, you know, and so I just say 4 golf courses. And so it turns out that the anal fin ratio is, there's more females with more intense masculinization in the community that uses reuse water for irrigation than in my community of San Carlos Park. And so it's like, you know, how does science work? So you say, right? Now what are we looking at? And so then I also started sampling fish and water from my campus at Florida Gulf Coast University. 760 acres, half of it in conservation land. The stormwater ponds, like almost every stormwater pond you see in South Florida, is simply that, a stormwater pond, right? They're not natural lakes or anything. And started sampling there, assuming that these would be control normal fish. And so it turns out that even on my campus, those female fish were more masculinized, were as masculinized as the reuse water community. And, you know, so again, septic came out better, not as bad. Everywhere I've sampled, there's masculinized females. And I keep going further and further afield, trying to find places that there aren't masculinized females. And so then it's like, okay, so what's going on my campus? And fortunately, Dr. Ju Chow has a machine that does chemical analysis of the elements. And so now I'm drying my fish, and she puts them in her XMF machine, and it can tell me how much lead is in them, and how much copper is in them, and all of these other heavy metals, which is a nice, relatively inexpensive analysis. And so all of this impervious cover that Buffy's, you know, that we were talking about at lunch, anything that's you know, this is asphalt, right? Or asbestos, and it drops and it makes it into the soil. If it gets percolated down through the soil into the aquifer, at least it's had some opportunity for being cleaned up. But when we're in a ditch and drain where we're like, get that stuff off the landscape, then we're putting it all into our water systems. And so I think what's happening in the reuse community is if you drive around this reuse community, everybody has green turf from here to eternity, right? And they're irrigating twice a week, if not more. The reuse community means that their irrigation is hooked up directly to reuse water, and they can irrigate as much as they want, okay? And they're using pesticides and fertilizers on that water. And so it's like, okay, that makes sense. Because in San Carlos Park, like I said, it's an older community. There's some houses that use pesticide and fertilizer, but not a lot. You know, maybe 10% instead of 100%. And then so okay, what's happening on my campus? And it turns out that, you know, we've got 15,000 students at FGCU now. And any place that there's a building, any place that there's parking lots, we've got stormwater runoff, and it's all being channeled into those stormwater ponds. And so I think that runoff from stormwater also has some of this in it. So you can hear a lot of I think and maybe, right? And so it's going to take a lot more work, science, money, to find out what all this is about. And so let me finish it up. So go back to the issue and go back to the solutions, because that's, to me, what's most important. You know, I could do basic science and say, oh, well, which chemical's doing this, that, or the other, but I'm not as interested in that as trying to find a way for the next generations to live as well as we have and to fix this mess, okay? And so the first one, of course, I'm an educator, right? And the hope is that with education we end up making different decisions. And I think one of the biggest decisions that we can make and our children can make and our grandchildren can make is simply what we consume. What we purchase, what we put in our body, what we put on our body. What we put in our land, right? And so, I don't know have any of you guys heard of the precautionary principle? So in Europe, they follow the precautionary principle with regulations and exposure to these chemicals. And in the States, we do the opposite. And so the Food and Drug Administration was formed in the 20s or 30s through a lot of compromise and stuff. And like I said, there's 80,000 chemicals or more that we're now bathing our planet in that weren't there before World War II. And so a chemical has to be found toxic, problematic, in order for anything to happen in this country. And so we started looking at regulations, trying to implement regulations and some sort of controls and some sort of awareness of these chemicals. And they're still called chemicals of emerging concern. So they're not regulated at all. And we don't measure for them. $600 for me to get an analysis of a single sample. That's why we're working on developing the methods at Florida Gulf Coast University so that we can at least get our heads around some of it. But it turns out that Johnson & Johnson, the products that they sell in Europe have a different formulation than they do in the States because of the precautionary principle. And so there are products available that are not full of these chemicals that we know are problematic. In this country, there are thousands of these toxic chemicals. How many do you think are regulated? 9. 9. Oh, 9. Yeah. So with education, hopefully, I believe that the consumers drive the system, right? Simply changing what we choose to consume. I'm incredibly sensitive to chemicals. And even somebody that walks in that has, like, they showered with Irish cream, that soap? Irish Spring, yeah. It's like I have to step away from them. And, you know, it's like, excuse me, I'm getting a headache and nauseous. And let's go outside to talk because I just can't cope. So I think is one of the biggest solutions. And the other is civic engagement. You know, Rachel Carson in 1962 with her book Silent Spring led to a revolution in this country that ended up with Richard Nixon starting the Environmental Protection Agency, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act. All of these happened because people said this must happen. And I think in order for us to go forward in a better way, we need the consumption changes, and we need civically engaged people to lobby our government, our elected officials, as much as other industries lobby our government. Other solutions for, like, after we've got this mess, we want to stop making it worse, but what else can we do? So septic tanks now have treatments that can make them less polluting, right? So we can retrofit our septic tanks. As I've said, the infrastructure for wastewater treatment facilities is woefully lacking. You know, it's 70, 80 years old, 100 years old. Pipes are cracked and leaking everywhere. And now we also, in our wastewater treatment facilities, there's something called tertiary treatment. So primary treatment is getting rid of the solids. Secondary is reducing the nutrients. And tertiary is getting some of these other chemicals out of it. And there's the state revolving fund to upgrade the sewer and the septic. There's money from the federal government, state and local governments. We had impact fees that got cut dramatically. And because of those impact fees cut, which is supposed to fund the infrastructure that new developments need, they cut those impact fees, so now my taxes are paying for those roads and that development instead of being able to be paid to get the people in my community on clean drinking water. You know, hook them up to a system where they have clean drinking water instead of septic or, you know, this groundwater. And on that graph, there's one line that's in bright yellow, and that's from a colleague's drinking water well. Blow me away concentrations of sucralose and atenolol in his drinking water. He's not drinking it, but it's there. So survey, educate, better engineering. I think we're good. How'd I do? Do we have time for questions? I hope I didn't go too long.
No. Any questions?
Yes, ma'am.
So where are we going to get an adequate list of products that we can use that are less detrimental?
A list of products that you can use that are less problematic. There's a number of organizations and entities that I direct my students to. There's the Campaign for Safe Cosmetics. The Environmental Working Group regularly puts out reports that have, you know, I think there's the Dirty Dozen for fruits and vegetables that you shouldn't be eating if you don't clean them up. So anything that you eat the entire fruit, you probably want to buy organic, okay? If it's a banana, you're peeling it, you're getting rid of some of that stuff. So there's also the Plastic Pollution Coalition. And so I think those are two really good ones. I belong to the Union of Concerned Scientists. So is that good enough? Good start?
Place to start, yes.
What else? Yeah.
I have a nephew who has a PhD in microbiology, and he will not take any of these vaccines. He doesn't want to take these vaccines. How do you personally?
Yeah, so what about vaccination? I have been vaccinated for COVID, and I'm thinking about getting the more recent one. And I'm also planning to get the shingles one because I don't want that. And I'm also planning to get tetanus because I walk around barefoot a lot. So yes, I believe in vaccination. And the research that went into making these messenger RNAs was a long time coming. It didn't just happen overnight. You know, so many, many years of development before we were able to roll this out. If I was much younger, I might be much more careful because we won't know. It's one planet, one experiment. We're not going to know about the effects on future generations. But I guess I'm kind of selfish. I'm looking for my quality of life. My sister Maymay just went on she came down here from Carolina and took a cruise with me. I thought she was vaccinated. She only had one. She got deathly ill. She's got heart problems, she's got fibromyalgia, she's got a zillion problems. Anyway, she spent the entire cruise miserable and the entire next 2 weeks miserable. So I am absolutely in favor of vaccination. Now I have little dogs and I'm not going to dose them with all of the vaccines at once, and I don't want to over vaccinate. I haven't looked into the research about, youngsters now, they're getting vaccines from birth to 6 months. I think that has led to a healthier community, a healthier population than if we hadn't had them. I saw another hand. I thought I did. Yes, ma'am.
I was wondering, you said the Johnson & Johnson products in Europe go along with their rules and regulations. Why is it that we can't see this?
Why can't we see this?
Why can't we know this?
Why don't we know about environmental endocrine disruptors as a population? We're just starting to become aware of nutrients, right? Because these harmful algal blooms are getting in our face and we can't escape from them. I think businesses have a very loud voice and they have an opportunity to market products. And there's also there's a number of books that have been written that talk about deniers and the power so one of Naomi Oreskes has a book called Merchants of Doubt that was, she started with the story about secondhand smoke. And scientists that were hired by them to deny lung cancer and the connection to cigarette smoke. And those scientists were the product of the World War II. They were physicists. They weren't biologists, but they were scientists. And so they were putting out that story that, we don't know enough. We don't know enough. And that's one of the main reasons why these endocrine disruptors are so hard to regulate or even say, hey, it's a problem. Because if I get exposed to that, it depends on what cell in my body is being affected. And it depends on what cell in my body at what point in development I am. So endocrine disruptors are most well known for feminizing females. So there's a scientist named Tyrone Hayes. If you've never heard about him, you should watch his videos. He was hired by Syngenta to look at atrazine. And what he found, and his model organism was frog. And so what he found was that these frogs were being feminized. So the male frogs were producing egg yolk. And some of these male frogs are actually producing eggs. And so in some organisms, you get feminization. In some, you get masculinization. In some, you get both. In some, it's an effect on the thyroid. In some, it's I didn't mention polycystic ovary syndrome, endometriosis. A lot of female reproductive issues have been, problems, not issues, have been linked to exposure to these chemicals. So it's a lot of things. And that's why I teach the course. And I'm continually integrating more of the course, and I teach another one called University Colloquium. And a big part of that one for me is environmental health as well. People have to know. And then they have to decide that they want to make a decision.
Here's a question. With CBD oil and marijuana being so prevalent now, what effect does that have?
So she wanted to know about CBD oils and marijuana on the body. There's some other really neat research about other psychedelics. Have you heard about like psilocybin and some others that have been incredibly beneficial in treating post-traumatic stress disorder and other conditions? And again, I think it's a case of the money. So we ended up with a war on drugs. But if those drugs were little white pills that pharmacists are selling, they're apparently okay. Right? So yeah, I think that this planet took about 5 billion years to be the way it is. And I'm much more likely to to try to find a medication or something that took 5 billion years to be created, instead of a little white pill that the chemists after World War II said, oh, this is cool, let's do this. We know one effect of atenolol, but we don't know them all. What else? Yes, ma'am.
Will the filters in our refrigerators filter out enough of all this?
Yeah, I think the filters in our refrigerators and other places are very, very effective. So charcoal just does wonders, and so I have a filter coming into my home, I have a filter coming into my refrigerator, and I have a filter in the refrigerator. And the water that I drink at work, I have a Brita filter. And so charcoal filtering is very, very good at getting a lot of these chemicals out of the water. Absolutely.
Do you look at bottled water or anything like that? I mean,
Oh, I haven't, but many people have. Yeah. And also, these plastics leach, right? And so all of these, any highly processed anything, right? And then you're buying it in plastic and you're putting it in the microwave, right? Yeah. There's plastics in those, and they are getting into your food. One of my colleagues a number of years ago looked at baby food jars. And it turns out that even the baby food, you know why? Because that lid's got plastic on it, right? When I was growing up, they were tin cans, right? And then our milk cartons and stuff were coated in wax. Now, any tin can, they're not always tin anymore, any soda, any beer, all of those containers are coated in bisphenol A. So with an uproar in baby bottles with bisphenol A, they stopped putting it in baby bottles, coating them, but baby bottles are still plastic because that's a lot lighter and it's not going to break when you drop it, right? But what they did was change from bisphenol A to bisphenol S, which is essentially the same chemical, but a little twist on it. And so that's another way where they stay ahead of the regulations. Did I answer your question? Yes, no, yes? Who else? Thank you.
Thank you.